Hi, everyone. I'm MJ, and today I'm going to talk about how to get into game development. The games industry is challenging to break into with typically far fewer positions than people who want to fill them. So it's quite competitive. Getting a degree in game development doesn't guarantee you a job in the industry. Some folks also teach themselves game development on their own, and they face similar challenges getting in. So with this video, I hope to show you some helpful tips on actions you can take right now to get started getting into game development and set yourself apart. I'll start with a bit about my experience, how I got into game development and the kind of work that I've done. Then I'll go over what game developers do, what skills they need, and what some of those different roles are. And finally, I'll give you my 6 tips on how to get started. I've worked in games for about a decade, and I've made a wide variety of things, including VR experiences, mobile apps, and multiplayer games. Primarily, I work as a game designer, but I've also done a fair amount of programming and just a little bit of art and sound. Here is an example of the game development process in action. This is a game called Hop the Fence. It is the first project where I had the role of lead designer. We started with an early prototype to test the kinds of gameplay and interactions we wanted, as well as getting a sense for the target device, which in this case was the Z-Space semi-holographic tablet. Then we moved on to a later version where we started experimenting with art and sound and implementing more of the gameplay. Finally, we have our completed version. This project took a total of 4 months and was completed by a team of 8 people. After a few years of working on small projects at small companies, I was fortunate to land a gig at a AAA game studio. I worked as a game scripter on Mafia 3 and Call of Duty Modern Warfare Remastered. A game scripter typically falls somewhere between game design and game programming. I had a wonderful experience working on Call of Duty, but ultimately I left AAA game development to start my own company called Astaire Games, where I now lead development on projects that I am really passionate about. So how did I get in? When I went to college, there were no degrees in game development, and honestly, I didn't even know game development was something you could have a career in. I majored in computer science, and I got an internship as a multimedia developer the summer after I graduated. While the company I worked for did not make games and my job was more closely aligned to a traditional developer, I did learn and develop transferable skills that helped lead me into game development. The following year, I entered a master's program in entertainment technology, which is where I took my first game design class. Having a master's degree is not at all necessary to becoming a game developer, but for some, it can be helpful to have that kind of structure while developing your skills. Having a master's degree is also really useful if you want to teach game development, which is what I do now, and I love it. But more than anything, what is important is to find a space and time to practice, and if you need structure to do that, then seek out structure. Even with a master's degree, I didn't get into AAA game development right away. My first few relevant jobs were in educational games and training simulations. You might dream of working on a big AAA franchise game, but having experience goes a long way, even if that experience is on projects that are loosely games related. Typically, game jobs are broken down into 4 categories, but there are other jobs at a game studio that fall outside of these, things like production, marketing, and QA, but I'm going to focus on these 4 categories for our discussion. We have art, 2D artists, 3D artists, textures, animations, all of that falls into the art category. We have audio, things like sound effect and music. We have design. This determines coming up with things like goals and challenges and game mechanics, and very importantly, the layout of the levels. And then we have writing code to create the gameplay and the interactions. Depending on the size of the team, you might have one person fulfilling each of these roles, or a team of many people with specializations within each category. It is also possible to be just one person fulfilling all 4 areas, but that is pretty uncommon and typically results in much smaller games. Here's a game called Litterbug, which I made for a game jam where I fulfilled all roles myself. This is a game about recycling and composting, and for this initial version, I created all of the art, the sound, and the code myself. After making this first prototype, I hired some interns and built a small team to continue development. And as you can see, it expanded and grew quite a bit, but ultimately it is still a pretty small game. So what do these 2 examples have in common with Call of Duty? They are all made from the same core components, which is art, sound, and code. These are the building blocks that games are made of, and they are held together by the design. If you want to be a game artist, there are many different styles and types of art that you could make. There's, of course, 2D art versus 3D art, where you're making models and textures. And even within 2D art and 3D art, there's animation, which is quite different, whether you're making character animations for a 3D game versus for a 2D game. And in the case of a 2D game, you would be making a sprite sheet, whereas in a 3D game, you would be rigging and animating with specific animation software. Within 2D art and 3D art, there is a wide range of different art styles. And when working on a team of artists, it's important to be prepared to be able to match the same styles as the other artists you are working with. When it comes to game audio, there are two major categories, and that is the sound effects and the game music. So there are people who work on the music for games, and there are people who work on the sound effects for games. Sometimes it's the same person, more often it's more than one person, or in some cases it is outsourced to a contract team that does audio for multiple different projects. Up next is game programming, where you create the logic and functionality for the game. Things like making a playable character controller, enemy pathfinding and behavior, and interactions like unlocking a door or taking damage from a trap. There are many different programming languages you might use, and often the language is at least somewhat determined by the game engine you are using. So for example, if you're building your game in Unity, most likely your gameplay programming will be done in C#. If you're using Unreal, you'll be doing C++. Godot is also C++. There are also smaller tools like Pygame, which uses Python, and a tool called Processing, which uses Java. There's a web-based game engine called Phaser, which uses JavaScript, and then there's also GameMaker, which has its own visual scripting language. Lastly, we have design, which tends to be one of the more difficult areas to get into for an entry-level position, but there are also quite a few different areas of design that is possible to work in. One of the more common areas, especially for starting out, is to work in level design. And much like art, level design is very different depending on if you're working on a 2D game or a 3D game. But basically, level design is involved with figuring out the playable space, how the player will move through the space, and where different challenges and obstacles will be placed. There's also UI design, things like figuring out where different buttons and icons will go on the screen, how to convey information to the player, and very closely related to figuring out the tutorial and how to teach the player how to play. And then there's also narrative design, which is how you tell the story to the player. In some cases, this is told through dialogue. In other cases, it may be told through things that you see and experience within the playable space, but basically figuring out what is the story of the world and how is the player discovering it. There's also system design, which encompasses kind of a variety of different things, but it depends on the type of game a lot of times, but it could be involved with figuring out things like how the different mechanics are going to work together, how different enemies, how combat would work, how to balance the combat so that none of the enemies feel like they are particularly overpowered or too easy for the player to encounter. And so that it's a lot of how different pieces work together and how those different systems play out in the player experience. So now that you know a bit about what game developers do and what are the different areas of game development, I want to leave you with some tips. These are generic tips for regardless of what role you might be interested in to get into game development. The first is don't get attached to the first language, tool, or style you use. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different game engines and a lot of different programming languages used with those game engines, and there are many different art and sound styles. So be prepared to try more than one and use a variety. And remember that a lot of that is dependent on the specific project you're working on. So if you go on to work in games, you should be prepared to learn something new when you are moving to a new project, which happens a lot in game development. I mentioned that there's really no need to get a master's degree. In many cases, it's not even necessary to have a specific bachelor's degree. They're not really looking for the specific piece of paper you have. But what is important is to find a place where you can have structure for learning the skills that you need. Training is important. Training is valuable. You can get that in a lot of different ways, and the skills that you develop are important, but the actual piece of paper that you have at the end is not really the thing that they are usually looking for. As you saw with my experience, it also can be really helpful to find opportunities that are games adjacent. It is difficult to break into the industry, and a lot of times they are looking for a fair amount of experience, but that experience doesn't have to come from the exact same type of game project that you are trying to work on. So if you find opportunities working in educational games, for example, there tends to be a lot more opportunities in that space, and then you can develop your skills and have some pieces that you are able to show. On the subject of developing your skills, it is very helpful in game development to develop skills that are both broad and deep. We call these T-shaped skills. So the T across the top is having breadth. So you have some experience in a lot of different areas, but then you also have depth in one specific area. It is typical on a game project that you will be focused on one specific area of the game. And so it's important that you have some really strong skills in a specific area. But it is also important that you understand other roles that are not yours. This makes you a better team player and helps you with communicating with the rest of the team. And lastly, it is really important to practice a lot, participate in game jams or join a game dev club or just make games on your own. But you want to continue to practice those skills at all times and to be able to show your work. And in terms of showing your work, it's really helpful to have some kind of process documentation. Some of the best ways to do this are with recording yourself as you're developing, writing about your process and experience, and taking lots of screenshots and making sure that you have screenshots at different parts of the process. You can then show off all of this work in a portfolio, which helps a prospective game studio to see what your development process is like and how you go about the process of making games. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section and I'll do my best to answer them. If you are ready to start learning how to make games, please like and subscribe and start checking out some of my other videos where I walk you step by step through some of the different areas of game development like level design, game scripting, and UI design.